all over the region. We had about 4 people from Kyrgyzstan who actually got the grants. One of them is with us today as well, Chevdik, and a couple are in the audience. And within this project, I have put together an excellent team with Bielefeld University, OSCE Academy, and Dr. Yuri Primakov. And my project is about Russian public diplomacy in the Kyrgyz Republic. Under the framework of this project, we have developed a smaller piece of work comparing German and Russian public diplomacy activities in the Kyrgyz Republic. I'm willing to share this information and research findings because it's quite fascinating. We decided to put together a panel, and we managed to recruit an excellent team, a fully expert team of speakers who will talk about different countries' policies in Central Asia. We will look at different aspects of public diplomacy. We will look at how countries shape their diplomacy, how they implement it on the ground, what sort of challenges they face in the region of Central Asia. And we really hope that you find this discussion interesting, enlightening, educating, and potentially we will spark a discussion, a larger framework discussion between policy world and academia about how to conduct policy diplomacy, public diplomacy, and how to make the most of it for all participants of the public diplomacy actors. And I would like to thank you all for being here again, and thank you to the online attendees as well. So as you know, we have Russian translation for those who are joining online. Please do make the most of it. We're hoping that it makes it more accessible to people to have the translation. And I would like to pass the word to my partner in crime, Dr. Yuri Primakov, and she's probably got a bad speech.
Yes, thank you so much, Ayjan, for these kind words. I just want to welcome everyone today. I want to thank once again my colleague Ayjan, Aygul, and the team of OSCE Academy for this kind invitation. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today and to represent Bielefeld University, as Ayjan was already highlighting. The project that she is conducting here at the OSCE Academy is funded by the Volkswagen Foundation that since 2019 has been implemented a new program titled Institutional Change and Social Practice, Research on the Political System, the Economy and Society in Central Asia and the Caucasus. This program is funded by Volkswagen Foundation, which is actually also the sponsor of today's event. I'm not sure that the microphone is working, so if it is maybe better that I switch to the second microphone, I can do that. It is okay? Okay, so yes, then we'll try. So since 2013, Bielefeld University has implemented different research professionalization projects here in Central Asia with the aim of enhancing cooperation between Germany and the region. And the particular emphasis of these programs has been posed on methodological competencies and research skills of students and academicians in the region. These initiatives were supported by the Volkswagen Foundation, in cooperation with our German partner, Dortmund University, and very welcoming local partners such as the OSCE Academy. Since 2019, we have a new professionalization project. I'm so glad to have here today Ayjan Shershenova, who is investigating Russian soft power and public diplomacy in Kyrgyzstan. We have Chevdik, who is also working in the framework of this program, and if I'm not mistaken, is investigating Kyrgyzstan foreign policy and foreign policy of Georgia. And we have in this room also another colleague, Dr. Alia Maralbayeva, who's based at the Alatu International University, where she's conducting a research on how to strengthen rule of law and human rights protection in Kyrgyzstan through access to justice, and in particular e-justice. And we have also another colleague from this program based in Kyrgyzstan who is following us online. She is conducting a study in this framework focused on local social economic survival strategies of mining cities in Kazakhstan and in Kyrgyzstan in cooperation with the American University of Central Asia. So today's workshop on public diplomacy and norm entrepreneurs in Central Asia has been organized in the framework of Ajan's project. And it is very much in line, I would say, with the overall program's objective of the Volkswagen Foundation, which is to support high quality and evidence-based research with an impact, not only for academic community, but also for practitioners, state and non-state actors and policymakers. With the first panel will be devoted to public diplomacy actors and norm entrepreneurs, by looking at the macro perspective. The panel will see the presentation of Dr. Ayjan Shashanova. She will be talking about Russian public diplomacy instruments in Central Asia. Her presentation will then be followed by Dr. Eleonora Tafur-Ambrosetti, who will be talking about Turkey's soft power and public diplomacy in Central Asia. And last but not least, we will have Sherbek, who is going to tell us something more about US norm promotion in Central Asia. Without any further delay, I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Ayjan Shashanova. As you know, she's postdoctoral research fellow at the OSCE Academy here in Bishkek, and before that, she completed a PhD in politics at the University of Leeds, UK. Dr. Shashanova has been also collecting important work experiences outside the university, working for UN and UNDP country offices in the Middle East. She's currently working on her project on Russian soft power and public diplomacy in Central Asia, and today she's going to share with us main finding of her research. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Right, so just a bit of a background of my research project. I thought that I have basically, before starting my research, I have worked for the USAID development projects in Kyrgyzstan. I got curious about how the US is promoting democracy in the region and Kyrgyzstan particularly. Afterwards, I decided to shift my attention to the European Union and see how the European Union promotes democracy and rule of law in the country. And I did my PhD on that and published a book. And then after that, I was running out of countries to look at. And I thought, well, there is an elephant in the room that I have ignored so far. And I thought I really need to look at how Russia is influencing the Kyrgyz Republic. And I haven't taken this project before because I thought the task is just too big, because Russia's influence is so huge. We share the past, we share the language, we have a long history of connection, conflict, contest. It's a very rich material. And I thought, well, finally, I have 3 years to focus on something as big as Russia's influence in the Kyrgyz Republic. But it's so huge. So I thought I'll find an angle to look at that is more than enough, that fits into the current narratives and the current relations between the Russian Federation and the Kyrgyz Republic. And I found this angle in the public diplomacy. That is on the rise in the Russian Federation at the moment, and where the Kyrgyz Republic is becoming one of the key recipients in one way or another. So that is why I decided to focus on Russia's public diplomacy in Central Asia in general, but my case study is mostly on the Kyrgyz Republic. And the reason why I thought that this research is interesting, and I can change the okay. Yep. So why I thought this was good, because I thought it is timely and very much topical. And you will see from further discussion, Russian foreign policy has evolved throughout the 90s through early 2000s to the current period. And it made around from West orientation, global orientation, to looking back in its former partners from the Soviet Union. So now Russia is focusing on the Commonwealth of Independent States a bit more. It's reinventing and reimagining its relations with the former members of the Soviet Union. I thought it is also under-researched area. While there are a lot of research about different aspects of Kyrgyz-Russian relations, most of these aspects focus on economic matters and social matters such as migration or Russian investment in the Kyrgyz Republic and so on and so forth. And I wanted to have a look at a slightly different area. I thought this is also a policy relevant research because a lot of countries that are working in Central Asia, they are curious about other international actors that are active in Central Asia. And very often the two countries come to mind. These are Russia and China. And very often for countries outside of the region, it's very interesting how exactly Russia and China hold their foreign policy within the region, how it is specific, different, what advantages or disadvantages they might have. And I thought it would be good for all actors to have a bit of clarity about how Russia works, how China works, and how they operate in Central Asia. I thought there might be some insights for academia as well, specifically for foreign policy analysis and for public diplomacy area. Given that soft power is on the rise nowadays with the rise of social media, of information and misinformation, soft power, propaganda, public diplomacy are often put together, but they're very much different. And I want to make this clear that this is not about propaganda, it's about public diplomacy, and there is a clear distinction between those two. And I thought there might be some insights for policymakers, both in Kyrgyzstan and other Central Asian countries and in Russia, on how to approach the region better, how to engage with each other in the best way, how to create mutually beneficial cooperation as equal partners. So that is why I focused on 3 building blocks for my research. I focused on Russian studies. I started with generic understanding of Russian foreign policy, and I shifted my attention to how Russia is promoting its soft power abroad. Because it has been on the rise for the past 10 years or so. It's more organized now. More funding is allocated for Russian soft power projects abroad. There are still certain negative connotations when you mention soft power, but there is nothing wrong with soft power. Soft power has been there forever. Nowadays, it just has become an instrument of foreign policy that needs to be understood and has to be employed in a fair way. I also looked at Russia as an economic power in the region because it's quite difficult to ignore that Russia is the biggest economy in our neighborhoods, and a lot of Central Asian countries depend either in terms of trade or labor migrant remittances on Russia. I also looked at Russia as a military power, while soft power usually does not include military power. I looked at the non-military aspects of military power, so to say, because Russia provides training. Russia provides equipment, so in a way it's development aid as well. I also looked at the more philosophical or removed questions about post-coloniality as applied to the region, because there are big debates whether Russia is a colonial power or is not, and if you say that Russia is, to which historical period you refer to. But there is definitely the influence of the Tsarist Russia back in the 18th century. That was a classic colonial power. So all the controversies aside, we can always focus on things that are quite definite. And I also looked at the near-abroad relations of Russia, because Russian foreign policy is very clear-cut. It has a policy towards the world, and it has a slightly different policy towards its near-abroad or the former Soviet Union. I also looked at Central Asian studies, because this is where Russia operates as a public diplomacy actor. And I looked at the post-Soviet political development, at the long search of our identities, both political, cultural, and historical identities, at the economic development and the different paths we take in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for certain countries in the region, we also have to take into consideration the donor dependence. Countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are very much dependent on donor aid, and one of the donors is obviously Russia. And I also looked at the public diplomacy area, which is quite big, and I had to look at the relation or how public diplomacy fits into the larger concepts of foreign policy and soft power. There is a notion of second-track diplomacy, the non-conventional diplomacy that operates from state to people rather than state to state. That's classic definition of public diplomacy, when foreign states are talking directly to the foreign publics, with, of course, talking to the state level, but the activities are usually directed specifically to the public of this country. And also, I wanted to make a clear definition. Soft power and propaganda are two different things. So when I follow Russian news, I make a clear distinction, and I make sure that if I'm collecting data for public diplomacy, I'm focused on the authorized public diplomacy actors and norm interpreters, rather than on controversial media personas who might be seen as very loud and very visible, but they do not necessarily represent the Russian state. I also looked at the concept of norm interpreters, and this is something that we explored with Chiara together in one of the publications we have prepared, which is quite interesting. It's basically when actors are trading in norms, they're bringing norms and values and they try to promote them. And in a way, norms have become a commodity as well nowadays. And in a way, it's interesting to look at it removed from the moral or ethical point of view, but looking at it as a commodity. What sort of norms and values are you selling to the publics of other countries? But I started specifically with Russian foreign policy because public diplomacy quite obviously fits into the foreign policy narrative. And I looked at the institutional framework of Russian foreign policy structure, starting with the president, because as you know, Russia is a very strong presidential country. So the president usually defines the direction of foreign policy. The Russian government as well is quite active. Obviously, they have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which has become the successor of the old and quite mighty diplomatic tradition of the Soviet Union. It inherited both professionals and structure, connections, the diplomatic missions infrastructure all around the world. And this is something that the rest of the former Soviet Union didn't get. And that's why Russia ended up with quite powerful Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a very strong network of diplomatic missions around the world. I looked also at the bilateral relations, multilateral relations with Central Asia as a region. But you also have to look at the deeper questions of Russian imperial and Soviet legacies, because the things that are happening now or the way things are at the moment are often rooted in the things how they were before. And we cannot ignore the history when we are approaching the present as well. But more recently, I have looked at the foreign policy, and you have to know the 30 years evolution of the Russian foreign policy to understand how it arrived at a certain point of public diplomacy in the region. So in the early 90s, it was the immediate post-Cold War environment. The president was Boris Yeltsin, and his right hand in all things foreign affairs was Andrei Kozyrev. And Andrei Kozyrev was a very pro-Western, quite liberal politician himself. So in a way, he set a direction for that short period of time where Russia was trying to fit into the westward narrative, so try to join Europe and the Western world in a way. However, there was a quick period of disappointment with the Balkan crisis, with the deterioration of relations between the West, the collective West and Russia, with the arrival of more assertive Yuri Primakov, who came with a different concept. His concept was multipolarity. He was one of the first higher ranking officials who started talking about Russia as a separate pole in the multipolar world that needs to challenge possibly the hegemony of the United States, at least in the 90s. And this period was signified with a competitive, peaceful coexistence, so to say. Russia was still in search of its niche in the aftermath of the Soviet Union collapse. And in the 2000s, Yeltsin has become a history, Putin came into power, and Putin's policy was largely new realism. And he had a succession of quite assertive foreign affairs ministers, Ivanov and later Lavrov, who were quite confident in positioning Russia as one of the poles in the multipolar world. They were quite strong in their sayings. They were quite difficult, so to say, to deal with for the West at least. But this was a period of the realism, which was followed with a contemporary Russian foreign policy, the third and the fourth presidency in terms of Putin, which was characterized with challenging the practices of the established international relations. It was neo-revisionism. And this is when Russia is investing more into international affairs. Literally, the funding has increased for soft power instruments. The funding has increased for the military operations abroad. The funding has increased for the development aid as well. Russia has become quite strong development aid provider, so-called non-conventional aid providers. They define it by OECD. But at the same time, what was interesting during this period for me, particularly for my project specifically, is the increased funding and increased political will that is invested in the soft power instruments and the second track diplomacy. So Russia is now talking more directly to people of other countries rather than to the governments. Obviously, this does not have to be either or. This is happening simultaneously, but Russia is increasing its presence. At the moment, Rossotudnичество has got missions in about
95 countries, if I'm not mistaken. The network is expanding, but it's also becoming more focused. So this is just a brief of what I said, and I will move forward to, I found this quotation on the website of Россотрудничества, or Gatchkofan actually, and I found it very significant because it actually describes the 30-year period very well. Russia is not angry, Russia is concentrating. After the defeat of the Soviet Union, Russia has been concentrating, and now it is revising its role, it's finding its niche, and it's working with its partners in a different way at a different level. And to look at the big picture, soft power mechanisms, I tried to put some visuals over there because it's just easier to operate with them. So in the first four, you can see the regional frameworks of the regional institutions, which are also elements of soft power because they create legitimacy, they create the sense of belonging, they create the idea of Eurasian integration within the region. So it's Commonwealth of Independent States, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. There is also a strong business element, investment, marketing. The Russian defense export is huge at the moment. Gazprom is running quite a lot of national companies in the countries of Central Asia. Russian export center is reaching far and wide. Those congresses there as well. It's an organization that organizes the expositions. But then you have individuals as well, such strong individuals. I didn't put Putin's picture because it's quite obvious he's there, but strong positions or figures in Russian politics as Sergei Lavrov. But then you also have celebrities who are getting Russian passports, moving to Russia, and basically being a soft power instrument as well. And then you have global media such as Russia Today and Sputnik, which is quite remarkable as well, because Russia Today is for global consumption, but Sputnik is specifically for near abroad. In the former Soviet Union, what is specific about Sputnik is that Sputnik translates and creates the news content in the local languages to engage better with local publics. And that's quite unusual. Only a handful of organizations, broadcasting organizations around the world can actually afford that, including the British Broadcasting Company, for example. But they are definitely establishing themselves in the region. And while Russia Today might be seen on the propaganda side more, Sputnik is actually more on the public diplomacy side of things and engaging with local publics more. In Kyrgyzstan specifically, or in the region, in Central Asia region, the CIS region, public diplomacy toolkit is quite clear-cut. There is Россотрудничество, which runs smaller offices within countries. In Kyrgyzstan, there are two, for example, in Ocean and Bishkek. And then they engage in cultural exchange and language support, in training, and memory studies in a way. So they engage and develop, invest into long-term relations on the ground. There is also Fond Ruski Mir, which is more on the traditional values side, but it's also engaged in humanitarian support. Then you have a highbrow sort of instruments of public diplomacy, discussion clubs. Valdai Discussion Club is a global one. Yevdaziy Novaya Volna is more of a local one, but it's also engaging at the grassroots level with local expert communities, with students, with journalists, and so on and so forth. And then you have larger and quite defined soft power activities, such as Besmertny Polk, which is Immortal Battalion, Immortal Army, which is there to commemorate the unity of the Soviet people in the Second World War, and Totalny Diktant, which is like a total dictation exercise. So this is to praise and support the language development in the countries. So in a way, these organizations and activities have been created in the past 10-15 years, and this is quite significant because this shows that Russia is creating a more organized and thought through instruments of engagement for the public in other countries. And it's quite easy to actually engage in our region because we are sharing past. The last 200 years or so have been spent together in one way or another. There is also past dependence from the Soviet times. You know that lots of our parents have gone through the Soviet education system, maybe us as well. So there is still past dependence. So whenever we're looking for an example of technological development or research, we look for the Russian sources first, and then we look somewhere else. Russian is still a lingua franca in the region. There is still a huge volume of labor migration, which also creates new ties with Russia, between Central Asia and Russia. And Russia is also a donor aid provider in one way or another. And unlike conventional donors, Russia includes military support to its development aid, which is quite different and quite welcome in the region. Actually, that's quite sneaky, because I used a picture that is part of the Japanese soft power. That was a Japanese manga series about Central Asia. So, but this was a really nice picture that sort of represents all 5 countries in a non-offensive way. And in conclusion, Russian approach to public diplomacy is very utilitarian. It has allocated quite a lot of funding, but the funding is getting more focused. So they're focusing on specific areas around the world now. And one of these areas is actually the former Soviet Union, and Central Asia is the most acceptable or more welcoming environment. There is also a top-down approach to public diplomacy actors with centralized funding coming from the federal budget, and then it just trickles down through different organizations to the grassroots organizations, either in Russia or in countries of Central Asia where they operate on the ground. There is also a focus on long-lasting relationships. So you wouldn't see like huge arenas full of people or very generous handouts or something like that. It's usually very targeted, small group work with specific groups of population, journalists, school children, students, teachers of Russian language, for example, and so on and so forth. There is also the shared bus and the Russian pool, the natural pool of Russia in Central Asia that is definitely helping Russia talking to the public on the ground. And the ideas of regional integration and Eurasianism are quite strong as well. And there are norms and values that are promoted by Russia, but they're different to the Western norms and values. They're not good or bad, they're simply different. And you have to look at it when you're looking at it. You have to look at the definition of feminism, definition of equal rights, definition of tradition when you're looking at the Russian norm interpretedness. And for that reason, that creates a lot of confusion. Right, I hope that was fairly interesting, but that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ayjan, for this excellent presentation. I think you helped us understanding not only how Russian foreign policy has developed since the 90s, but also to familiarize a little bit with important theoretical concepts that we will be using today during the afternoon. So I see that the next speaker is already online. I'm so glad to welcome Dr. Eleonora Tafur-Ambrosetti. She is a research fellow at the Russia, Caucasus and Central Asia Center at ISPI. Prior to that, she was a Marie Curie Fellow based at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, and where she has pursued her PhD. Her interests include Russian and Turkish foreign policy, EU-Russian and Russia-Turkey relations, the EU neighborhood policies, and today she will be talking about Turkey's soft power and public diplomacy in Central Asia. Thank you, Eleonora. The floor is yours.
Grazie mille, Chiara. Hi, everyone. And first of all, I'm really pleased and honored to be speaking here, although I'm very sad not to be in Bishkek today, and I'm looking forward to visiting Kyrgyzstan again. So I'll share my screen. Yeah. I hope you can see it now. First, a few words on Ayjan's presentation, which I really enjoyed. My focus during my PhD especially was Russia's and Turkey's understanding and implementation of soft power, and I dealt very much with conceptual problems in defining soft power for countries that are not liberal, because soft power, as you know, is a concept created and mostly used in the context of liberal democracies such as the US or the EU, Japan. So it's been quite a challenge to first define and use a concept of that was more neutral. And for that, I did a lot of theoretical work using also Gramscian political theory. So it was really interesting to see another colleague using and trying to use this concept for Russia, and I'm looking forward also to reading the outcome of Aycan's research in our publications. I will deal today with public diplomacy in Central Asia, and I will first say a few words about this research. So I was asked to deal with this topic in the framework of an edited volume that is going to be published by Routledge, and looks at public diplomacy in quite a wide area, because it's going to deal with the Indo-Pacific, but also the Middle East. So it's quite a huge study, and I'm concentrating on Central Asia. But of course, I have to sort of narrow down my case studies, and I decided to focus on 3 Central Asian countries that are Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. The reason for that is first of all, because otherwise it would be too wide. Second, because Tajikistan is not usually considered as a Turkic country, and Turkey relies quite a lot on this Turkic brotherhood narrative for its soft power and public diplomacy activities. And Turkmenistan, on the other hand, was quite difficult to study, given the political situation and the closeness of the regime. So the research, I think, is quite interesting and timely because of several reasons. First of all, the Turkish public diplomacy is quite a new sort of research area, and Aycan was commenting on the fact that soft power and public diplomacy have been existing for years. But in the Turkish case, the concept is fairly new, and the first time it was mentioned in public discourse is 2004. So the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, is seen mainly as the main actor for this public diplomacy endeavor, and they actually created the first institution dealing specifically with public diplomacy in 2010. It's the Prime Minister Office for Public Diplomacy. The second reason is that Central Asia bears a strategic importance for Ankara. Of course, probably the Turkish focus on the region was more relevant and more, let's say, evident in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Turkey was aiming to build this sort of big brother image for the newly created Central Asian states. But the Turkish foreign policy has always had this focus on Central Asia. It continues to have quite a lot of importance, and it's evident also looking at the developments of the Turkic Council and other dimensions of Turkish foreign policy that we will talk about it in a moment. As I told you, I decided to focus on 3 countries, and I am still conducting in-depth and semi-structured interviews with academics, journalists, and CSO members. Of course, I decided to focus on cultural elites for my interviews, because Unfortunately, given the period with the COVID emergency, and given also my commitments at ISPI, I'm not able to travel, and that makes it very difficult to focus on the wider civil society, to conduct focus groups, or to talk to people, basically, to reach out to politicians as well. So the cultural elites were the primary targets of my interviews, because they're more reachable and more open to talking to me. And finally, this is work in progress, so I'm not that advanced as Aycan, of course. This is bad because I'm lagging behind my publication schedule, but it's also good because I'm able to incorporate your tips for the structure of the research, but also for possible interviewees. So please, I'm looking forward to your comments. I don't want to, you know, to lose too much time on defining public diplomacy, because we have limited time allocated for the presentation, and also because Aycan talked about it. But I think it's important to say a few words about how the concept developed. Of course, like virtually every concept in IR and political science, public diplomacy is a contested concept. And we have here the definition of the Center on Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California. I think one of the centers of excellence, probably the center for studying public diplomacy. And here we can see that the concept evolved quite a lot in the last decades. It was first narrowly defined as the means through which a sovereign country could engage with foreign publics. So the states were the main actors in this process. But now it's more and more common to adopt a broader definition. So we have more players, non-state actors coming to conduct public diplomacy, either in tandem with the state or more independently. The aim is always the same: to communicate, to engage with foreign publics, and you know, to promote a state's image and some foreign policy objectives. In this case, I think there is no difference between liberal and illiberal soft power and public diplomacy. This is all about achieving influence, regardless of you know, how democratic a state conducting soft power or public diplomacy is. But I think there are some differences when we talk about illiberal states. And in the case of Turkey, unfortunately, this caveat is very important to make, because Turkey is going through a growing authoritarianism process. So it's becoming less and less liberal, and that has some repercussions on the way it conducts public diplomacy, and on the way its public diplomacy activities are perceived by foreign publics. So first consequence is that the civil society organizations are less and less free to conduct independent action. So they're more tied to the government, or they're limited in their activities. The second, and connected to the first one, is that the activities carried out by a non-government actor and the ones carried out by government actors are more difficult to separate. So in a context where the state has an increasingly important role, it's very difficult to have to perceive to have independent non-government activities. And the third, as well connected to the first two points, is that there are some as an interviewee put it, hybrid actors who may have hidden political agendas. So it's more difficult to tell propaganda from genuine public diplomacy. As Aycan was also mentioning, public diplomacy is not propaganda. But in the case of illiberal countries, of course, we can see it's more difficult to tell one from the other. I'm going now to talk about first the main institutions that conduct state public diplomacy in the 3 Central Asian countries, and then we will talk about non-state public diplomacy actors, and the importance and the data and that you find here are based on desk research, but also the insights from my interviews. So some of them will be quote. Some of my interviewees will be quoted directly. The first, I think, institution that I should talk about, it's not here, but I mentioned it before, is the Prime Minister diplomacy, and this is an office that is important because it coordinates all activities in the realm of public diplomacy. And as I told you, it was created in 2010, and it's important because it's really giving a sort of coordination and a fil rouge connecting all Turkish public diplomacy activities and actors. In the case of Central Asia, I think that one of the most important institutions to talk about is the TICA, the Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency. It's important both because development is seen as one of the most important sources for soft power and one of the key public diplomacy tools as well. But also because the TICA was born in the context of the demise of the Soviet Union, and it was born with a specific goal in mind, to help Turkic republics to develop their identity in a sustainable way and to help improve their infrastructures. So TICA is present in all of my case studies, so in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, and in Uzbekistan. Here we see one of the latest activities. I think it's like a few months ago, TICA donated some quite a substantial number of medical devices to a center for disabled people in Nur Sultan, and this is, of course, the type of activities that many other cooperation agencies around the world would carry out. So in this sense, TICA is not different from other cooperation agencies doing the similar things in other parts of the world. Another important development actor is the Turkizilay, so Turkish Red Crescent. This is the largest humanitarian organization in Turkey, well integrated in the international Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. Here we see the head of Turkizilay Central Asia regional delegation meeting with the Kazakh head of the Red Crescent Society in October. So of course the regional representation of Turkizilay engages with all of the other Central Asia's branches of the Red Crescent Society. Another important aspect of public diplomacy is culture, and I think culture is seen by an overwhelming majority of my interviewees as the possibly the most important source of soft power and public diplomacy focus for Turkey. This is because there is a large understanding of Turkey and these Central Asian states as sharing the same identity in the sense that they share culture, religion, shared past, and ethnicity. So this understanding, I think, informs cultural public diplomacy activities. And here we have two important institutions, the Yunus Emre Institute, that however is only present in Nur-Sultan. It organizes language courses, exhibitions, film festivals, but I think one of the probably like the most important cultural public diplomacy actor in this sense is TRT. So the Turkish Radio and Television Corporation. It's very important because media play a very crucial role, I would say, in spreading Turkish images and narratives. And in the case of Central Asia, there is a special channel focusing on Central Asia and the Balkans. And here you can see the screenshot of its Twitter account. The slogan, Dilde, Fikirde, İşte Birlik, it means unity in language, thought, and work. So you can see even in the slogan how Turkey tries to stress this this unity with Central Asian states. Then talking another important element of cultural public diplomacy is the Turksoy, the or International Organization of Turkic Culture. This is UNESCO of the Turkic world, and afterwards it was established in 1993, and in 2009, it gave way to another important organization for Turkish states, the organization formerly known as Turkic Council. These two organizations, it's important to stress that they're not founded by Turkey only. I mean, it's a cohort of countries, including Azerbaijan, which is not, of course, a Central Asian state. But in both processes, it's important to note that Turkey had a major role, especially in Turksoy, because in 1993, the Central Asian states were dealing with the effects of the fall of the Soviet Union. So Turkey, one of the first organizations that Turkey established to promote this Turkic word idea was Turksoy. And with the Turkic Council as well, I mean, it's in another context because we are already at the end of the first decade of the 2000s, so it's a very difficult political situation. But still, Turkey is the main driver of this organization, and in fact, there is a recent development, the change of name. Promoted as well by Turkey. Now the organization is not the Turkic Council anymore, it's the Organization of Turkish States. And some of the observers of the organization see some fomentation of pan-Turkism in this move by Turkey, and a renewed commitment to establish influence and to cement influence in the region. It's also important to see, however, that this organization is growing and is receiving more and more interest in the region. Uzbekistan joined in 2019 as a full member, and then we have two new observer states, Hungary and Turkmenistan. And the recent summit of the Organization of the Turkish States, it was at the beginning of November, was also attended by all the members and observing members, head of states and government. So it's really getting more and more interest by states in the region. Non-state public diplomacy actors include think tanks, schools, universities. Yes.
This is Bishkek calling. I just would like to ask you whether you can maybe conclude your presentation.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
This is also very crucial endeavor for public diplomacy and non-state actors. Here you have some universities and schools present in the region. Of course, it's important to see the internal developments in Turkey, and especially after the coup attempt in 2016, had a huge impact on public diplomacy because before the Gülen schools were one of the main non-state public diplomacy actors, and now, of course, the Turkish state is trying to close them down. Then you have companies, of course, SMEs especially. You have the Turkish Airlines, which is, I think, one of the most remarkable company in spreading public diplomacy, and it's also being called the rising star of Turkish soft power. Non-state actors include, of course, also actual actors, and the TV series and films are pretty widespread in the region and followed. So here I want to focus your attention on the first Turkish Uzbek series. And this has been called by my interviewees as one of the main achievements for Turkish public diplomacy, because it's very popular, and especially Emre Kıvılcım is really a star in Uzbekistan. So my last conclusion, my last comments look at future trends for public diplomacy in Central Asia. First, there could be and there is, I think, more skepticism towards China and Russia's public diplomacy activities, deriving from some geopolitical developments. First of all, China is regarded probably as not as an important actor as Russia, but also there is a growing skepticism towards the BRI, and some concerns about the debt trap, following the huge investments for the BRI. There is also the question of Russia's treatment of Crimean Tatars, and of course this could also have an impact on Russia's image in the region. The second is more military prestige after Turkey's involvement in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, and this is evident because, for instance, Uzbekistan has signed a military agreement with Turkey, and Turkey is seen as a reliable partner also by Kyrgyzstan in the framework of its conflict with Tajikistan. Third trend is the growing role of Uzbekistan after Karimov's presidency as the gateway in this case for Turkey's return to Central Asia. So the relations between Uzbekistan and Turkey improved and are improving very much. So this could also be a state to follow closely in regard to Turkish public diplomacy. The very last point is how growing authoritarianism in the country makes Turkish public diplomacy less credible. And I want to quote Aycan, who kindly granted me an interview for this research. She talked about wolf diplomats promoting, for instance, or asking Central Asian states, in this case Kyrgyzstan, to close down Gülenist schools. So when foreign diplomats are regarded as agents of the state, only carrying out political objectives, they're seen as less credible public diplomacy actors. And this is my very last point. I thank you with this beautiful Ebru painting picture.
Thank you so much, Eleonora, for your presentation, for providing us very good overview of Turkey's soft power and public diplomacy in the region. I also liked actually how you pointed out that when we are talking about public diplomacy, we are talking about a very contested topic. And I think one of the objectives that Aycan and I had when we decided to organize this roundtable discussion was also to figure out something more about the substance of public diplomacy, looking at concrete empirical examples on the ground. So thank you so much for your contribution to that. Now we are finally back to Bishkek. We will listen to Sherbek, who is going to talk about US norm promotion in Central Asia. He decided to offer us a very, I would say, provocative title. So I'm expecting a provocative speech as well. For those of you who do not know, Sherbek is a postdoctoral research fellow at the OSCE Academy, and is also co-founder of the Research Institute Crossroads Central Asia. He previously served as Deputy Director of the OSCE Academy and as Dean of Academic Development at the American University of Central Asia. He holds a PhD in International Relations from the University of St. Andrews, and I'm so glad to give you the floor now.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Those in the room, those in the Zoom. Where's the Zoom? Should I look there? Okay, good to see you all. I saw that there are much more people there than in this room, in that room. All right, I'll be talking about the United States, and unlike the previous speakers, this doesn't come as a result of particular research, so I'll skip the methodology and theoretical framework and so on. But on the one hand, the United States is much easier to talk about. On the other hand, it's much more difficult, and I'm sure you all understand why. But a good place to start is to note that I myself was a participant of the United States public diplomacy, and as many of you probably were, precisely 20 years ago, in September 2001, I was in the US as an undergraduate exchange student. So we went there for 1 year. But you remember what happened in September 2001 on the 9th of, was it 11th of September, 9/11, so yeah. So about less than 2 months after we arrived, that terrorist attack happens. And there was no Facebook there, no Twitter, no kind of social media to see, observe, read discussion. We had mailing lists. So there was a group mailing list for that, our cohort of students, all the post-Soviet students in various parts of the United States. And after the event, there was a discussion of the event, of course, obviously. And one of the students emailed something like, this terrorist attack was probably a reflection of or response to what the United States has done internationally itself. And then there was a quick reply followed up by the coordinator of our exchange program saying something like, don't bite the hand that feeds you. Probably it was a verbatim quotation implying that, yes, you being in the United States on the US government funded program, don't really question what US has done. And I'm not going to judge the merit of that exchange, of course, of that email exchange, because that was a particularly stressful time for everyone, as you remember, if anyone witnessed that. That was stressful for those in the US, but also very consequential for everyone outside the United States, especially in this part of the world. But that thing, that quote, that phrase of "don't bite the hand that feeds you," from the US government program coordinator, is a very telling illustration of some difficult inbuilt dilemmas of the US non-promotion, of US soft power in general. That is how to combine teaching and preaching and promoting the values of open society, of critical thinking, of questioning, with the more prosaic interest of national interests. And I think US soft power throughout its history has always been haunted by this dilemma, and I'm sure we all are very well aware of that. We can come back to that issue shortly, but to start with the presentation, I don't have any slides, but I'll speak around 3 questions mainly, and very short version is what, how, and why. Specifically, what links soft power in general with the United States, how exactly the US has been promoting itself as a soft power, as a normative power in Central Asia, and why we see the outcome that we see. And of course, that assumes that we kind of agree what the outcome was, but we can come back to that later. But the question, so to try to explain, find explanatory variables, factors, what explains, let's say, the failure or success or none of that of the US in Central Asia. Of course, the caveat is always there that I may speak about Central Asia, but I don't pretend to be an expert for Central Asia. Probably whatever I say is mostly inspired by what I see in Kyrgyzstan, because we live here and we know here. Central Asia is a very diverse region. But anyway, so let's start with the easier part. What is about soft power and the United States? And here, the only thing I want to say is very briefly to remind that this notion of soft power is very central for the United States. We all teach students, and if there are students, you remember now that we quickly refer to Joseph Nye whenever we speak about the soft power. If you remember, in the late 80s, in early 90s, the Joseph Nye's initial article about soft power was pretty much essentially a policy advice for the US government. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union as a threat was gone. And the US had this kind of dilemma of what to do, given the declining the economy. At least as Joseph Nye writes, there was a choice between US withdrawing from international commitments. Now there's no more threat, there's no motivation, there's no something that wakes you up at night. So just what like Trump tried to do, inward looking, withdrawal, and so on. And so Joseph Nye's whole point of soft power was that no, the world is different. US as a world hegemon cannot withdraw. It should continue leading. And if there is no military threat, then that's exactly the point where we should lead the world by example. We lead the world by attracting, not through rockets and bribing dictators, but by demonstrating what we are, who we are. That is the soft power, cooperative power. And of course, you don't remember, that was something novel for me when I reread Joseph Nye. He writes about the environment at that time in 1990, the declining power, which was what? The Soviet Union, and the rising power, which was what? Japan, it happens. He mentions China sometimes, like as just describing it as a less developed China doesn't really matter. So the context was that Japan as an economic power was very much on the rise between 85 to 95. In that period, the GDP growth of Japan was it tripled, and it was much better performing than the United States. So, but of course, Japan was not a military power. It was not what is China today or Russia today for US, or what was the Soviet Union. So in the view of Joseph Nye, so US had some essential benefits: liberal economy, market-based economy, liberal political ideology, the attraction of the US popular culture, Hollywood, Harvard University, his sites, those things that make United States attractive. So basically his point was that, yes, we will be attracting, we can attract the world without forcing them. So US, in short, has been already central for this whole thing of soft power. But if we turn to Central Asia, in 1991, we appear on the world map as a bunch of new countries. And when we speak about the United States in Central Asia, I'll have to make a quick caveat to switch from the notion of soft power, and I'm not even using public diplomacy, so you see that different verbs and words that we use. I'll be talking about the norm promotion as one particular, more specific way of defining soft power. In fact, of course, soft power and norm promotion are very different things in a certain way. When we say soft power, this is essentially a national concept, soft power of the United States. Now, later, Vera's also write about soft power being attribute of international organizations, non-state actors, but as it coined, it says power. So it was essentially in the context of the geopolitics, just by different means. Norm promotion is what we mean by promoting democracy, promoting human rights, promoting free and fair elections, and so on. So I suggest that in Central Asia, the United States has been most active in norm promotion. And I will not need to list everything. From the very beginning, all the post-Soviet countries have been by default in transition, right? We didn't even claim that. That label was basically granted to us just for the fact that we decided we are normal communists and we didn't like communism. So we were named, okay, you are in transition. And the United States has been primary world leader at that time. That was a moral authority, not only military superpower, but moral authority, knowing what is good and right, what kind of economy, what kind of reforms are needed, and so on. So the collection of the values and norms that US would promote was there, and it was not designed for Central Asia. It was United States world approach. And for the tools, you know, this exchange programs, many of you have probably been the educational exchange, cultural exchange, the educations like the American University on the street and further in the town. In some way, the OSCE Academy could be defined. The US has been one of the biggest funders of the institutions like the OSCE Academy. But also in the government, US and the Europe in general, the West in general, multilateral organizations have been funding governments for reforms, for the right forms of reforms, for the reforms that were kind of part of condition for aid. So you remember all that discussion of aid conditionality. There was aid coming, but in case of only when you promise particular reforms that are about transparency, about shrinking or making smaller states, and so on. Now, independent media, support for civil society, those are the tools that we can probably skip for later for the discussion. Now, let's turn to how question. No, that was how US tried to do it, and now the why question. Why we have what we have. So what we have 30 years after 1991. Unlike the economics or military, the soft power, public diplomacy, or the degree of attraction of a state is difficult to measure. So I don't think it's easy thing to compare US versus non-US like Russia, China, or to compare the US of 90s versus today. Basically, there's no measurable data in that area. However, I think I can afford myself kind of maybe a bit polemical, controversial, but generalization to say that there is a discrepancy between norm formalization and norm internalization that happened in Central Asia as a result of the whole industry of norm promotion. Call it democracy promotion, call it building market economy, and so on. everything, like for the sake of discussion, if we group that as the United States non-promotion in general, there was no outright rejection of that throughout 30 years. If you look at our laws, our whatever we declare, whatever documents we signed up as Central Asian states, the formalization was okay, but the degree to which that we lived up to those things that we committed is a big question. And of course, there are various caveats. Kyrgyzstan is different from Turkmenistan in terms of to what extent, what kind of norms got settled, how things changed between 1991 and 2021. So that said, if we say that in general, in Central Asia, norm internalization, that is becoming or accepting what US wanted to promote, so the internalization basically failed. Look at Freedom House, look at all, in general, any measures of the democracy or liberalism in Central Asia. I think that's more or less evident. So without discussing whether US succeeded or not, I will assume that it hasn't really succeeded, but the question is why? So that's the final set of my points. Why US has failed. And I think my title says failed, abandoned, or suspended. And the basic idea was that not really stress badly that it failed, maybe it didn't fail, but those three things were meant to point to different agencies or different factors that can explain. So if we talk about that, I think there are three arguments that you can find in the literature, in social media, or in discussions in general. The first is about the United States. The argument is that US non-promotion has failed because of the United States. So in other way, United States abandoned on time. Urgent works. The United States abandoned the Central Asia, and that argument is quite strong. On the one hand, we hear in the context of Afghanistan that as soon as US left Afghanistan, we hear that it left Central Asia. There was nothing else in Central Asia that would still maintain United States interest. So US lost interest. Central Asia has, from the very beginning, not been ever at the top of US list. This is a faraway region, middle of nowhere, and thanks to Afghanistan, there was an aberration or deviation. But the 90s, when we thought that we are under democracy promotion, the US is so big, there was nothing specific about Central Asia. It was simply the age of the United States, the 90s, the prime US in its prime, and it was everywhere in the world, including Central Asia. So that's the argument. Number one is that it's about US. Each president is losing attention even more. Trump probably never even mentioned the word Central Asia. I don't remember, or democracy or Central Asia, and certainly not those things together. I don't remember. He was in power for 4 years. The second argument is that the US withdrawal is very much about the impact of Russia, impact of China that we'll hear later today. That is extra-regional alternatives to the United States. The argument is that in the 90s, Russia was itself almost a pro-Western country until middle of 90s. So Russia wasn't playing at all its own game of soft power, although Russia is by default the biggest soft power here. China, as Joseph Nye writes in 1990, was a less developed country. It wasn't even in the radar of anyone, even of the geopolitics people. But now things changed, of course. Since 2000s, you have Russia has been very much resurgent. Russian-Western relations increasingly going from bad to ugly, from color revolutions, from Chechnya, Yugoslavia to color revolutions to Georgia, Crimea, and so on. And China, Russia has not only been alternative, now growing as an alternative norm promoter, but particularly anti-American norm promoter. That is, you don't hear much about what Russia is, but if you watch Russian television, which is very popular in Central Asia, it's all about Russia or US. It's mostly about US and Ukraine, particularly the Kerry Canal. That is the expressly anti-American narrative coming from the government-funded media of Russia and given the fact that the media, Russian media is very popular, Russian language still is powerful, and close to millions of Central Asians are back and forth in Russia. That is seen as one of the arguments that Russia is resurgent and pushing away the United States. China is less so, particularly because of language, because of the lack of background that China has with Central Asia, or the particular background that China has that is not really, that doesn't make it really attractive by default, but China has been catching up. Yeah? Now, the third argument is that the US failure is mainly about Central Asians, and that is the smallest argument. You don't hear much, but the argument is that yes, US failed. It didn't abandon them, it didn't suspend because of Russia or China, but it really failed. It tried, but it failed. Because of what? Because the non-promotion has been from the very beginning culturally insensitive, that is, and built on assumptions that proved to be outright wrong, that we were on towards democracy, that our governments really meant what they declared or what they promised. It turned out that not at all. So it was a set of miscalculations, misperceptions, and eventually Central Asia was simply not a party that was to be attracted. I think the truth is probably somewhere in between, and those three arguments, whether it's about US or more about Russia or more about Central Asians themselves, I don't think we have to choose one of them. Probably they are related, and more than that, I think they constitute each other. You cannot speak about Russia growing without knowing that US is losing its interest in the region, or vice versa. So in conclusion, I only say a couple of, I would like to leave with 3 points. This is really kind of remarks. The first, I think I had my list here. The first is about the specifics of the US soft power. Unlike Russia and unlike Turkey, and like many other countries, the United States is very peculiar in a sense that its soft power is converged with universal values, or at least claimed universal things. And that is both weakness and strength of the United States. It has been its weakness, we know that, in Kyrgyzstan or in Central Asia, speak about gender equality, speak about LGBT particularly, those things that are seen as very sensitive. And if the US claims that those attributes of individual freedom are universal, then you can easily meet many people saying that who decided that those things are universal, and those are some kind of limitations of the US. However, the convergence of universality and American national also has some strengths, because some things are truly universal. Things like justice, notions of accountability, notions of human dignity, those are at the heart of all the norms that US kind of promotes. And those things will most likely survive, even though US may forget about Central Asia altogether. The things that it represents, US will keep being attraction because of the kind of accountability, kind of governance it has, kind of economy it has, or kind of freedom that it grants to individuals. That is number one. Number two is, let me finish with this one. 2 weeks ago, I just realized yesterday that there was a presentation of a book called Soft Power in Central Asia. And there was a YouTube discussion with a program that's basically almost similar to ours. I don't think there was a copy paste because, yes, because we planned it 3 months ago, right? 6 months ago, yeah. But the title says that Central Asia, soft power in Central Asia, and the subtitle says the power of influence and seduction. And then one of the arguments is that, look, Central Asia has been seen as a pawn for too long. Kind of geopolitics, hard power. Now it is time to acknowledge that Central Asians are not eşkıya, not pawns anymore. So that's why we are discussing now soft power. But I think, and it strikes me, Central Asian strikes me that it's exactly the opposite. If we speak about soft power, if we speak about non-promotion in Central Asia, that exactly reminds us that Central Asia is still a pawn. It's still a peshka, because if that's a power of influence, or power to influence and seduce, that is, there is someone out there to be influenced, someone out there to be seduced, or if we say winning hearts and minds, it implies someone's heart, someone's mind that is there available to be seduced, to be influenced. So the view of Central Asia is still a silent object that is there for others to struggle for, to influence, to seduce, and so on. So I think for whoever would study soft power in general, I think it is time for those arguments that Central Asia is not a pawn. If we really want, if we mean that, we have to be moving more towards appreciating Central Asia's agency. What is in Central Asia that responds to those efforts by Russia, by Turkey, by United States? Because otherwise we end up studying kind of Central Asia, but effectively we're studying United States, we're studying China, we're studying Russia in Central Asia, but Central Asia remains rather a territory, an object, a site, but without, still bracketed for us as researchers. I think I'm beyond my time. I'll finish here. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much for this very insightful presentation. Once again, you provided us with background information on the concept of public diplomacy, looking at soft power from a theoretical viewpoint, so where everything originated. Actually, public diplomacy is a part of soft power, it's a dimension of soft power. And I think what I also enjoy in your talk was this idea of norm promotions, which is a process requiring both the diffusion and the internationalization. And I absolutely agree with you that we tend to look at the diffusion part, but we don't look at how these norms, how these values are perceived, are interpreted, are somehow implemented. And I think looking at the internalization process will also show us that there is a lot of resistance going on. And this is something that we are not always aware about. And this is also the reason why public diplomacy strategies are not always so successful. They forget that there is this interpretation, this reinterpretation going on the ground. And the final beneficiaries are the ones who decide what to buy and how.
And this panel focuses on the implementation of public diplomacy on the ground. And Dr. Chiara Pirabon is going to talk about German political foundations as norm and openness in Kyrgyzstan from the point of view of the social capital. And Dr. Chiara Pirabon is from University of Bielefeld. She's also a postdoctoral research fellow here at the OSCE Academy, and she has worked closely both in academia and in policy world. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Aycan, for your kind words. What I will present today is actually part of the research we have been conducting together, but it is integrated with some thoughts coming from social capital theory. We have been talking in the previous panel about public diplomacy as a process of norm diffusions. And what I would like to do today is just to maybe provide an example of how we could approach, we could analyze this process, looking at specific components coming from social capital theory. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, actually, because social capital is such a controversial concept that I think will produce very provocative questions as well. So when we're talking about German public diplomacy, it is important to know that it is not a new phenomenon. So the first example of German public diplomacy goes back to the creation of the German national state in 1871. but the German public diplomacy assumed a new role, a role of pivotal importance, especially after World War II, when it was employed as a way to somehow repair the country's ruined image abroad. And in this framework, since 1962, the newly established Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development have provided funds to the so-called Partei oder politische Stiftungen, political foundation in English, for conducting social political education programs in developing countries. I use the term in German because this is a specific, I would say, form of organization that you find in Germany. These German political foundations are publicly supported organizations with a unique legal and political status. They have representation abroad, and they are basically working for German political parties who have been represented in the German Bundestag for at least 2 mandates, but they work abroad independently from these parties. At the same time, the budget that they have at disposal is or depends on the, let's say, weight and the presence of the affiliated party in the Bundestag. This is a very interesting construction. A review of the literature reveals that this is not a new topic from an academic viewpoint. There are interesting studies showing how, for instance, German political foundation can be considered important channels for transmitting norms and values as well as political contacts. At the same time, they also function as norm entrepreneurs by persuading their partners to redefine their identities and interests and by involving them in a social learning process. So now we don't need to ask ourselves whether public diplomacy is a question of norm diffusion. In this case, it has been already, let's say, proved that German political foundations are active as norm entrepreneurs on the ground. They also operate as network and infrastructure builders by helping to regularize channels of communication and collaboration among domestic NGOs and between NGOs, government, and international organizations. And here we are with our state-to-people contact and people-to-people contacts. If we look at their involvement on the ground, they make use of very similar methods and instruments in terms of organization of public lectures, workshops, seminars, regular events. They have scholarship programs. So from a, let's say, an operational viewpoint, they have very similar tools that they employ. Nowadays, there are 7 German political foundations active in Germany, and 4 of them are active in Kyrgyzstan. These 4 organizations or political foundations active in Kyrgyzstan are the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, which is affiliated to the Social Democratic Party of Germany, Hans Seidel Foundation, affiliated to the Christian Social Union, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, affiliated to the Christian Democratic Union, and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, affiliated to the Linke, the lefts. So now, before we proceed with, let's say, the empirical part of my study, I think it is important to briefly introduce the theory of social capital. My study, or what I tried to do in my study, was to evaluate, or at least to analyze the outcomes of main projects and initiatives implemented by political foundation in Kyrgyzstan in terms of creation of social capital. And in my study, the definition of social capital that I used, there are different definitions, is the one coming from Putnam, who described social capital as citizen engagement in community affairs that can have a powerful influence on the performance of government and other social institutions, and in terms of the connections among individuals and the social networks and norms of reciprocities and trustworthiness that arise from them. Now, the concept of social capital is very debated. The second thing which is very debated is the operationalization of social capital. How can we measure it? So the World Bank has done an amazing job in this field through the Social Capital Initiative, providing examples of how to use social capital for measuring development, but also for promoting development. And if you look at the body of literature coming from the Social Bank and the World Bank and the Social Capital Initiative, we can see that they identify two main dimensions that are relevant for social capital: the structural and the cognitive dimension. So structural social capital can be described as the properties of the social system and of the network of relation as a whole, and more precisely as the impersonal configuration of linkages between people and unit. Altogether, it is possible to distinguish three components of the structural dimension of social capital: the bonding component, which refers to the relationship among members or actors that are similar. We have then the bridging social capital, which is about the relationship among groups or actors that are dissimilar, maybe for age, socioeconomic status, education, and ethnicity, and so on. And finally, we have the linking social capital, which refers to ties between people with different position of authority, so different, let's say, position of power. And the second dimension I consider in my analysis, the cognitive dimension, can be described as shared representations, interpretations, and system of meaning, mainly codes and narratives, shared values, and other cultural elements. For Torrigiani, the cognitive dimension is about a set of shared knowledge and information possessed about the problems that the actor or group must deal with, including heuristics owned by the individual and the sharing of common meanings. It is a little bit theoretical what I'm saying, but it's just a presentation, let's say, of the theoretical framework I employed in my study. I think in a couple of minutes, you will understand a little bit more about the meaning and substance of cognitive and structural social capital and all these different dimensions considered. So the analysis of the cognitive dimension of social capital in the case of German political foundation operating in Kyrgyzstan revealed that there is a high level of convergence concerning the normative engagements of German public diplomacy actors. I identify in my analysis 5 main fields, normative fields, and they are normative fields because these fields are very much related to a set of norms and values that made them. And we can see that the foundations are working on similar issues and sometimes even in similar ways. So the first important field of normative engagement is represented by the promotion of good governance. And this is especially a field where the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, the Hans Seidel Foundation, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation are active. The second field of normative engagement emerging from the analysis is the promotion of inclusive, participatory, and professionalized media, where especially Friedrich Ebert Foundation, Hans Seidel Foundation, and Konrad Adenauer Foundation are active. The third field is the promotion of women empowerment and gender equality, where I could see especially the Friedrich Ebert Foundation and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation engaged. The fourth field, the promotion of environmental protection and environmental education, is a field where especially the Hans Seidel Stiftung and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung are active. And finally, the promotion of a dialogue on foreign policy and security issues is a field where I could see both the Friedrich Ebert Foundation and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation active. So these are main fields of engagement, of normative engagement. These are fields that are very dense of values, of norms, of specific visions, let's say. And what is not, I would say, surprising, these are common areas where the four German political foundations selected for these studies are operating. I hope you could see here, maybe you couldn't see the colors, what that means. So here I try to represent these different fields with, yeah. Let's try to do that if it is possible. It will not work probably, or? Okay, then it will not work. So the first example I want to share with you today is the promotion of good governance. What I want to show you is how German political foundations are operating in this field, examples of concrete activities, example of kind of cognitive social capital and kind of structural social capital produced also through some quotations from the interviews that I conducted with these public diplomacy actors on the ground. The first example I want to make today is the project entitled Civil Society and the Media, Guarantor for the Integrity of Local Self-Government in Kyrgyzstan, through which the Hans Seidel Foundation engaged in promoting good governance by providing citizens, and here I quote, with more access to participation processes, information processes, and more possibilities to influence public decisions. The project was conducted with the financial support of the European Union and sought to establish a social dialogue and network between the civil society, local media, citizens, and local self-government, and to enhance the capacity of civil society and the media to work together with local self-government to gain people's trust. This is a quotation taken from the European Commission, so this is also part, if we want, of the public diplomacy of the EU in Kyrgyzstan. In the framework of this project, public hearings and dialogue forums brought together state and non-state actors and fostered close cooperation and integration of civil society and media representatives with local government, through, for instance, the inclusion of the former in local budget planning processes. And this is a clear example of the linking form of social capital. In addition, as stressed by one of the organizations, I interviewed the project contributed to the creation of bridging social capital, since the target group civil society included not only the staff of officially registered NGO, but also volunteers working for free in more informal groups such as youth, women, elderly, health committees that are typical of the Kyrgyz civil society sector. A good example of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, just a second, let me see if it works. Here, in the field of promotion of good government, is represented by another EU-funded project aimed at fostering and monitoring the education reforms in the Kyrgyz Republic. The project was aimed at improving the work of the Public Advisory Council under the Ministry of Education and Science, and its capacity of monitoring the education reform process and of representing public view on education issue. So capacity building training were offered to the members of this EPAC and representative of civil society to enhance their understanding of the education reform process and their skill in designing and implementing public policy, also by taking into account European best practices. The project contributed to creating bonding social capital, since these new interaction mechanisms were established especially between EPAC and civil society. So we are looking at the civil society sector, not the population at large. At the same time, the project contributed to the creation of the linking type of social capital, since there was establishment of platforms for structural dialogues between the government and civil society, through which the latter was involved in consultation, policy making, and policy implementation processes. So this is basically a way to try to not quantify, but at least try to show what kind of results were achieved through all these activities. Now, if we look at the two remaining political, German political foundations, I decided to focus on the topic of promotion of women empowerment and gender equality, since I would say in this field we can see different strategies used by the political foundation. In the case of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, gender and gender equality was enhanced by, for instance, promoting the participation of women in politics and political processes, especially at the local level. In this framework, there was the involvement of the so-called Association of Local Women, where female activists from Chuy Oblast shared their experience of civic engagement with women in other regions of the country. Similarly, women leaders and experts in Bishkek were involved in monthly public meetings during which they had the opportunity to talk to representatives of the parliament, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economic and entrepreneurs, and so on. And in this way, the foundation they tried at least to include them in decision-making processes, so creating a linking form of social capital that allowed them to enter, let's say, this field. I don't have so much time and I want to conclude my presentation. So I just want to mention one last example concerning the promotion of women, empowerment and gender equality on behalf of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation that was active in the past year in Kyrgyzstan through a cooperation with a cultural organization named School of Theory and Activism in Bishkek, STAP. The collaboration between Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and STAP took place especially in the framework of specific projects, such as an evening school called Against Nature, Queer Science Fiction Art that took place in 2016. So the activity was focused on stimulating a discourse on queer theory that was critical to traditional politics of identity, but also to Western mainstream LGBT activism. And these courses, these activities were attended by artists, feminists and LGBT activists, journalists and researchers from Bishkek and Almaty who met every weekend over a period of 3 months and a half. In this case, we can see that the kind of structural social capital that was produced is a bonding kind of social capital. So the activities were very much focused on a specific target group. I would say a limited, restricted segment of the population sensitive to this LGBT topic. So to conclude, since I want to share my conclusion with you, the importance of social capital theory for the engagement of political foundation here in Central Asia was confirmed by the interviews and also by the data I conducted on the ground, although no actors on the ground mentioned social capital, but I could see it in the interviews, in the ways they described the outcomes of their activity, that social capital theory was included in their engagement from a programmatic viewpoint and also in the implementation of the activity. What is relevant, I think, in this study is that the cognitive social capital allow us to point out the similarities in the engagement of German political foundation, and the structural dimension of social capital pointed out the differences in the strategy and modus operandi of these foundations. Overall, the analysis also reveals that German public diplomacy contributes to questioning the original Anglo-American procedural model of soft power that was presented in the previous panel, based on understanding, informing, and influencing, offering an alternative based on partnership, cooperation, and dialogue. As a matter of fact, COVID-19 has affected the work of German political foundation active in Kyrgyzstan and elsewhere, and forced them to go even more digital, thus contributing to further developing the so-called new public diplomacy that we have not mentioned today yet. Remarkable, the divide existing between rural and urban areas regarding both access to digital services and digital education risk to exclude major strata of the population living in more marginalized areas of the country. At the same time, virtual communication and interaction cannot replace face-to-face contact that are of pivotal importance to generate trust and sense of identity, which is the starting point for social capital and production of social capital. Nonetheless, information and communication technology also offer unprecedented opportunities for bridging and linking more actors at once. Indeed, global technology can give more space to local experience and help amplifying local voices and local stories, in line with the German dialogical and collaborative model of public diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. I've learned a lot about social capital. This is something I have not heard before, so definitely very interesting. And our next speaker is Dr. Karolina Kluchevska. Karolina is a postdoctoral researcher at the Ghent Institute for International and European Studies. And she also got her PhD from University of St. Andrews. We've got quite a few graduates today as speakers. And Carolina has worked in development aid and the governance in Central Asia. So she's got both practical and academic experience. And she will talk about soft power of neoliberal civil society in Tajikistan. Carolina, would you like to share your slides if you can?
I don't have slides. I'm going for a traditional presentation. You don't.
That's fine. That's what the other graduate of the St. Andrews did. So I can see a trend over there. Please go ahead, Carolina.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ayjan and Claire, for this invitation, first of all. So my presentation will be a bit different from others in a way that I'm looking from the inside out, so through the perspective of actors on the ground, rather than those who project the soft power or use these different public diplomacy tools. And this will be a story about quite untypical soft power of neoliberal civil society, not typical in a way that it is not a soft power projected by a particular state or a particular organization, but this is more of an idea that has been adopted by a big number of organizations. So this is more about my story is about the international internalization process rather than norm diffusion per se. This is something that was also mentioned in this discussion here. So I will refer to a book chapter that I wrote together with Payam Foroughi from the infamous book on soft power that Shayabek mentioned as a competition for this event before. And I should also say that my interest in civil society comes from my personal experiences as an NGO worker. This is how I moved to Tajikistan first several years ago. So soft power as an idea, right? It is implemented by many Western or Western-dominated organizations, because then we have UN that has many member states, not only Western countries, but we need to look at where funding for civil society actually comes from. So for some of these organizations, obviously, civil society is the main sphere of activity. For others, they link it with different projects, so different norms related, for example, to women's empowerment, free elections, and so on. So what concepts do we have here at stake? What is this idea of neoliberal civil society? So first let's look at civil society, which in a basic definition is a domain where citizens associate according to their own interests and wishes. But of course, over the history in many different places in our planet, and maybe also in other spaces, there have been different forms of civil society in terms of how this space of citizens interacts with the market and the state. So if we imagine it as a triangle, right? We have the state, we have the market, and we have the civil society here. This is the dominant understanding within Western development aid. And the idea is that the civil society here actually has to balance both the state on one hand and the market. So there is this kind of balanced relation between them. And of course, this idea goes back to Western history, Western understanding of civil society, which was, first kind of spelled out on paper during Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century. In the very specific context in which there was this changing, industrializing society that started to balance the state, and also the market was changing as a result. And then we have the Cold War context in which civil society was used as a tool by both the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc to influence the so-called Third World, the countries in between them. And then in the late 80s, we have the story of the Solidarity movement in Poland against the communist government, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, and different figures and movements which framed themselves as civil society. And this is why, where this idea of kind of effective civil society against an oppressive government appeared. So another concept that we need here is neoliberalism, right? As a set of norms and values associated with free market capitalism. So for example, what comes in this package is withdrawal of the state, individual, rather than state responsibility for welfare and well-being of people. idea of entrepreneurship, that people need to be, you know, smart entrepreneurs. They shouldn't expect anything from anyone apart from themselves, and also competition. So when we combine all of these together, we get a neoliberal civil society, which, as you know already, this is not a surprise for anyone in this audience here. This is part of broader processes related to the influx of multiple Western actors to Central Asia in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which development aid was used, you know, as a soft power tool aimed at influencing and we can even say emulating political and economic trajectories in this region as a transitional tool towards liberalization, democratization, emergence of free markets. So my story here is how actually all of this was received in the case of Tajikistan. And I'm going to tell you briefly what was happening in the 90s and what is happening in the recent years, because I think it shows very much the transition, because you know, soft power is also not something that is stable. It's something that evolves over time for different reasons related to kind of internal factors within the soft power, but also external factors. So in this case, this is developments in Central Asia and agency of actors who actually participate in these processes. Let's look at the 90s then. I will just tell you that in 1991, there was one officially registered civil society organization in Tajikistan, the first one. Of course, there was civil society before, different forms of civil society, as we know, but not as NGOs, the way we understand it now. So of course, there have always been, you know, chaykhana, the tea houses, the bazaars, mosques, and so on. Komsomol, if you want to kind of include the state-sponsored Soviet civil society, but not NGOs as I discussed it just now. So the first target of this donor-funded soft power were local activists who were usually, you know, they usually had this usual set of features. And this is a story here that is very common not only for Tajikistan, but more broadly for Central Asia and the post-Soviet space. What will be unique about Tajikistan are reactions, I think, from state actors. But the common story is that the targets, so the urban, well-educated, pro-secular, Russian-speaker individuals, mainly from kind of Soviet elite families or families that were well integrated into the Soviet system and benefited from it, people who previously gained leadership experience, for example, in the Soviet youth organization, the Komsomol, or in women's councils, Zhensaviete. So they had this kind of unique, but also very common profile for Soviet intelligentsia, let's say. Why these people became interested in neoliberal civil society? Of course, because there was a Soviet collapse, the collapse of the state, in the Tajik case, also the civil war. So when other spaces for activists closed, the NGOs opened. And this is why in Tajikistan, as I said, in 91, we have one NGO, in 93 we have 33 NGOs, and then in 97 we have 225 NGOs, and then when we go on, the peak in 2007, 3,500, which is still lower than in Kyrgyzstan, but it is a very significant number. You know, without going too much into detail, if we look at the concept of soft power in the kind of classical way articulated by Joseph Ney. Soft power is this capacity of actors who projected, you know, it's a power of attraction and seduction, right? So it needs to have, according to Ney, benignity, competence and beauty. So how did these three factors look like in the case of neoliberal civil society in Tajikistan in the 90s? Well, benignity, by offering local activists space for activism and you know, also providing them funding and decent salaries in a context where other sources of income were not possible simply. And then the competence, of course, because NGO activism came together with a new set of skills which had to be taught to this NGO activists. It came together with regional and international networks that these NGO activists became integrated in, but also an inspiration. Of course, this is the beauty factor of soft power, because this was a new value system, right? This kind of associated rhetoric and this ideology of civil society, which replaced, we can argue, and some sort of an ideational vacuum, which was brought about by the collapse of the Soviet Union. So then when we look at reactions from other actors, well, let's take the Tajik government at the central level first. Very often in political science literature in English language nowadays about Tajikistan, there's this narrative about, you know, there's the war, there's kind of opening of political space, and then there's the decline. But I think that this kind of opening of the political space is actually, well, shouldn't be interpreted as democratization for sure. Because why the Tajik government in the 90s was more optimistic towards NGOs? It wasn't because it shared some values or because, you know, it wanted NGOs to grow, but simply the state was busy with other things. And first of all, there was no, you know, we can say absence or very weak government because of the war. No funding, you know, massive outflow of educated cadres abroad, or people moving from the government to the NGO sector because there were better salaries there. So you see that this kind of triangle doesn't hold from the beginning, right? Because if NGOs were supposed to balance the state on one hand and the market on the other, what we had in the 90s is that actually these NGOs here, they are the market because they provide salaries, you know, for NGO workers, but also all of this industry around, you know, security guards, interpreters, cooks, realtors, catering companies, printing houses, whatever else you want. But also the relation with the state is not so straightforward, right? Because it's kind of, you know, cooptation of part of the state. The rest of the state doesn't really care. So NGOs didn't really balance anyone, unlike the donors wanted. Then going to the local government, in the 90s, local authorities, they lacked basic funding, of course, so they were mainly grateful for NGOs for, you know, basic services that they provided, starting from gas supply to reconstruction and some sewage systems. But this is, of course, a purely pragmatic cooperation. There's no idea of civil society. This is mainly based on this kind of material incentives. The general population, of course, we shouldn't downplay the role of NGOs in the 90s because they did a great job in assisting women and children, especially in the context of the war, right? We have 25,000 war widows and 55,000 war orphans in Tajikistan. So NGOs, you know, provided some kind of support, like food and medical services. So then jumping quickly to what is happening in the recent years. First of all, the activists, the NGO people themselves, they are, let's say, less grateful to international donors than they used to be. And this is because the kind of internal features of soft power changed. So first of all, there is increased conditionality of funding. On the one hand, there is this rhetoric of, you know, local ownership and listening to local partners, but actually there is in practice just bureaucratization, projectization of development aid. And as a result, NGOs often, you know, see themselves as service providers for international organizations and donors rather than partners for discussion, which of course they were never equal because this is a giver-receiver recipient relation, but there was in this regard more equality in the 90s according to NGO activists in Tajikistan. So there is this growing resentment among NGO activists, but again, this resentment is not about the idea of civil society per se. This is again based on material grounds. When we look at the central government, of course, on the one hand, we see here, let's say, a division, right? Those NGOs that work on purely political issues, they will face troubles as they face troubles in many other countries in the post-Soviet space. And of course, this happens in the context of colorful revolutions, right, that were locally viewed as Western manufactured and due to, you know, foreign support to NGOs operating in Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan. Then we have in 2014 the Russian Foreign Agents Law. So of course, this is reflected in Tajikistan, this attitude to a certain extent. But on the other hand, there's this separate tribe which very much resembles what happens in Russia and Kazakhstan at the moment, that those NGOs that work on social issues, so providing support to, let's say, so-called vulnerable groups of population, you know, people with disabilities, people with HIV/AIDS, these are welcome to work. However, of course, they have a completely different relationship with the state than NGOs that work on elections. I don't think there's anything like that in Tajikistan at the moment, but if someone wanted to work on elections, they would be in trouble. So this is also a strategic choice for NGOs what to do. But in this way, they also, you know, find the new tensions with donors arise, because donors actually very much want to do their political stuff and just outsource it to NGOs in practice. And then quickly, the local government, again, there's this very pragmatic approach, unlike at the central level, in which so local authorities, you know, they became used to outsourcing many of NGO services, a kind of state services to NGOs. And this is, you know, again, we can say, is this collaboration? But that's actually very pragmatic, right? So maybe it's two at the same time. The population, again, you know, those who receive help from NGOs, like in Kyrgyzstan, they say sorry, right? They care about NGOs, they are grateful. Other people don't really care. So going to the conclusion, what does all of these tell us? There's the story of soft power of neoliberal civil society in Tajikistan. It is a complex story, right? It's a story of post-Cold War geopolitics done through development aid. It is a story of political economy of Tajikistan, which is you know, more severe than in other Central Asian countries, but it's similar trends, you know, related to precarity, in the 90s to the Soviet collapse, and precarity resulted from these countries' integration into the global economy as this kind of precarious states, right? But this is also a story of agency of local activists. And there is a paradox here, because there are many, of course, people working in the NGO sector who are genuinely interested in what they are doing. They want some social change. However, just because they work for NGOs and they have this NGO label, their activism is actually you know, not perceived very well, or its value is diminished because of this association with kind of Western mercenary kind of activists. So you can say they're also victims of all of these broader contexts happening. So just to conclude, is this a case of internalization of ideas promoted from norms and values promoted from outside or not? Well, I would say that the answer here is yes and no again. Is there love and for donors and gratitude? As you know, for soft power to be successful, there should be love and gratitude. That there's this idea of neoliberal civil society. Well, not really, right? Because as I told you, even those who work for NGOs, they also developed a resentment towards their donors. And the rest of the population doesn't care, right? But on the other hand, the idea of civil society, of neoliberal civil society, is there to stay. So this can be seen as success of this soft power. But also this idea transforms and evolves all the time. And especially we see it when it comes to relations between the NGOs and the state. This is where the most changes happen. So I will finish here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karolina. Very fascinating to see the similarities between Tajik and Kyrgyz civil society and their position and perceptions. Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Fabienne Bossut. She is assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at Ghent University. She's also a coordinator at the Ghent Institute for International and European Studies and co-director of the Russia platform of Ghent University. And Fabienne has worked extensively and for quite a few years on the EU Central Asian relations and has been involved directly in some of the discussions about the most recent EU strategy towards Central Asia. So we're very much looking forward to hear from Fabienne about the EU public policy in Central Asia. Thank you, Fabienne.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Can, and also Chiara, for organizing this highly interesting event and for inviting me to contribute to this panel. It's really a great honor to be part of this amazing panel. So what is the focus of my talk? Well, in my talk, I will give a brief assessment of the EU soft power in Central Asia and also of its public diplomacy efforts in Central Asia. Now, generally, if we assess the EU's role in the region, we've seen in the past 3 decades that the EU has really gradually positioned itself in Central Asia as a leading actor in trade, investment, and development aid. And in those 30 years, the EU's role in Central Asia has really evolved significantly from what is probably little more than just an invisible and arguably ineffective donor in the 1990s to that of a real strategic player by the late 2000s. Today, the EU also relies on a wide set of public diplomacy tools in Central Asia, including student exchange, mobility, but also cultural diplomacy. Now, at the same time, in today's Central Asia, the EU unfortunately seems to be losing the struggle for the hearts and minds of the Central Asian people. And it's clear that in a region that is marked by authoritarian resilience and the rise of of conservative and even also Islamic values, the EU's attraction is rather limited. Moreover, the strong influence of Russian media across the region acts as a powerful counterforce to the EU's soft power in Central Asia. And there's no doubt that the Russian narrative of Europa and the Russian narrative of an EU that is in perpetual crisis are severely undermining the EU's attraction in Central Asia. Now, in what follows, I will first provide an assessment of the EU's soft power in Central Asia, and then I will move to assess its public diplomacy. Now, in first providing insights into the EU's soft power in Central Asia, I will make a distinction between the different components of soft power, namely cultural, economic, and political/ideational. Now, first of all, economically, well, the EU's model of advanced economic prosperity and social welfare continues to appeal to people in Central Asia. But China, as the world's new economic powerhouse, has become a strong contender of the EU in terms of economic attraction. Moreover, given the considerable amount of labor migration from Central Asia to Russia, also Russia, of course, still maintains a strong position in Central Asia when it comes to economic attraction. Now, nevertheless, the economic component of soft power is the strongest when it comes to the EU's soft power in the region. So people across Central Asia dream of living in a country with the same economic prosperity and the same social welfare standards as those of the EU member states. And also this European quality label acts as an attractive brand for consumer goods, but also for a certain standard of living. And we can see this, for instance, on the property market. People are attracted to the idea of being able to live in a house or a flat that meets European standards of living. Let me now move to discuss the EU's cultural soft power. Culturally, the EU draws its appeal mostly from the distinct cultures of some of its member states, and I would say especially Italy and France. People in Central Asia have this romantic idea of French culture, but also Italian culture, and they dream of visiting cities like Paris and Rome. But also more generally, Europe has a strong reputation of having a long-standing history and having played a crucial role in world history. Now, unfortunately, the EU seems to lose the soft power competition in Central Asia when it comes to the values dimension of cultural soft power. And in this sphere, the reach of the EU soft power is severely challenged by Russia's soft power, whose focus on traditional values relating to the role of family. Well, this resonates much more with the people in Central Asia than the EU's liberal values of democracy, human rights, and good governance. Now, for the time being, through its public diplomacy, the EU continues to profile itself in Central Asia as a so-called guardian of liberal values, but also as a benign power that is keen to contribute to the sustainable development of the Central Asian countries. But in a region that is marked by authoritarian resilience and the rise of conservative and Islamic values, this image of a guardian of liberal values is proving to be ineffective and even counterproductive. Now, finally, when it comes to political soft power, now, of course, there is some overlap here between what I said is like the ideational, the values component of cultural soft power, and then the political soft power. Now, but when it comes to political soft power, the picture is a bit more mixed. So in principle, people in Central Asia consider the political model of liberal democracy that is prevalent in the EU. they consider this political model to be a legitimate political model, but they doubt whether this is a suitable model for Central Asia and for the Central Asian countries. So in addition, the influential Russian narrative of an European Union that is in perpetual crisis has also undermined the appeal of the European political model across Central Asia. So people in Central Asia now seriously doubt the benefits of liberal democracy as a political model, and they think that it's because of this model of liberal democracy that the EU actually has been undergoing so many crises in the past 15 years. Now, before I move on to discuss the EU's public diplomacy in Central Asia, I would like to conclude this first half of my talk by mentioning that the assessment that I presented here of EU soft power in Central Asia is fairly general. It's not based on concrete evidence-based research, simply because there has so far not been any such research, or only very little research. That said, we should soon have some concrete evidence-based insights into the EU soft power in Central Asia, thanks to a 4-year research project that I'm running at Ghent University, which focuses, among others, on the EU soft power, but actually also on China's and Russia's soft power in Central Asia. And it's being implemented by John Irgenchiro, who I think is now also actually following the event online. So hopefully as soon actually we can, apart from this general overview, also give you some very concrete evidence-based insights into the EU soft power. Now, what about the EU's public diplomacy in Central Asia? So how is this manifested? And also to what extent is it effective? Well, when it comes to EU public diplomacy, it's important to clarify that it's only from the late 2000s onwards that the EU started more actively to think about public diplomacy. Hence, it's from then onwards that the EU started developing several policy and communication initiatives that specifically served to advance the EU's public diplomacy. And it's especially actually in the last decade that the EU has significantly advanced its external communication policies and strategies, with an emphasis on the visibility of EU external action, including through social media. And the EU's public diplomacy has been especially fast-forwarded under the mandate of the previous EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Federica Mogherini, up to the point where they're even talking about the Mogherini effect. Now, also important to know is that EU delegations play a really crucial role in the EU's public diplomacy. It's really the EU delegations that are the focal point for communication towards the local population. And they're also tasked with organizing public diplomacy events and projects on the ground. Now, most of their work on the ground in this respect pertains to cultural diplomacy, which you could see as a sub-component of public diplomacy. Now, in the case of Central Asia, just like in other regions, the EU delegations are tasked with the organization of several cultural events, including concerts, film festivals, and art exhibitions, in an attempt, of course, to promote European culture. Now, to give you just one example, each year Bishkek hosts the annual European Film Festival, and it shows several European films, each time with Russian subtitles. So we have similar film festivals in other countries in Central Asia. I'm just mentioning the example of Bishkek because the event today is of course taking place in Bishkek. And this annual event is organized by the EU delegation together with the EU member states that have embassies or in Bishkek. And nevertheless, I should add that although the number of such EU activities has been increasing in Central Asia, overall EU cultural diplomacy remains relatively limited in Central Asia, especially if you compare it to the Eastern Partnership region, where the EU is much more active in this regard. Countries like Ukraine and Moldova, there the EU is much more active in this respect. Now, another aspect of EU public diplomacy in Central Asia is higher education. In Central Asia, but also in other regions, the EU relies extensively on its exchange programs for students, also for researchers, namely through Erasmus+, previously Erasmus Mundus, it's now called Erasmus+. And this also includes funding for research cooperation. So it's not only about exchange and about mobility, but it also includes now quite a considerable amount of funding for research cooperation. In addition, the EU also relies on its funding opportunities through its network of so-called Show-Money chairs, Show-Money centers of excellence, and Show-Money projects. But again, these are less extensively used in Central Asia when compared to other regions and countries in the post-Soviet space like Russia and Ukraine. Now, if we go back to the role of the EU delegations and EU public diplomacy, well, in addition to being responsible for the rather traditional public diplomacy tools such as cultural events, conferences, exhibitions, and so on, the EU delegations now also increasingly have to rely on digital diplomacy tools. They have a specific mandate from the EU to resort to social media. And as such, for instance, the latest EU public diplomacy work program really stresses the role of EU delegations in developing what is called in that work program a joined up and coherent narrative. And they are even requested to shift to a storytelling approach with a focus on campaigns rather than showcasing isolated initiatives or isolated projects. Now here I can provide you with some concrete insights into how the EU has been relying specifically on social media in Central Asia. And this thanks to the research I have been conducting for an academic article in a forthcoming special issue on EU public diplomacy. And so for this I have been working together with John Irgenjiro, Domenico Valenza, and Rashid Abdulhagov. So together we've been looking into EU digital diplomacy in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. And we've done this by analyzing the posts made on the Facebook pages of the EU delegations in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. So what we found is that in both countries, so in both Uzbekistan and in Kyrgyzstan, the EU through its Facebook posts seeks to showcase, well, EU achievements, and it does seem to also portray the EU as a sort of superior model for the Central Asian states, but in a rather unidirectional relationship of master-pupil or donor-recipient. Now, however, we did find some variation between the two countries, so between the Facebook posts in the case of Uzbekistan and the case of Kyrgyzstan. So there's some variation in how this superiority is presented. So in Kyrgyzstan, the EU displays the country as a rather passive recipient and openly advocates its political norms and values. So I mean the EU's political norms and values, and it does offer open criticism directed to the Kyrgyz authorities in case of norm deviation from the EU norms that, from the norms that the EU upholds. In Uzbekistan, it's slightly different. Here, the EU portrays itself more as a so-called primus inter pares, and so it sort of depoliticizes its discourse more than in the case of Kyrgyzstan. And here you can see that the discourse focuses more on providing capacity building and offering technical expertise. Now, how can we assess the discourse of this public diplomacy in the case of Central Asia? Well, this is of course only based on this research that I did together with some other researchers. Well, I would argue that such a discourse might perhaps work in the Eastern Partnership countries, especially those that want to join the EU. As countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. But in countries like Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, I think such discourse will do little to help boost the soft power of the EU in the region. And I would argue that it can even be counterproductive. As I already mentioned earlier on, well, in a region like Central Asia that is marked by authoritarian resilience and the rise of conservative and Islamic values, the EU's attraction overall is limited. And so in such a context, I think the promotion of liberal values and the messaging of ideational superiority holds little chance of being effective. Okay, but what should the EU then do instead? Well, based on another paper I recently co-authored for another special issue, but special issue in Central Asian survey, of which Carolina actually is co-editor. There, we argue that the EU should decenter the Eurocentric and the neoliberal approach that it uses in its engagement with the Central Asian societies. So if the EU wants to have a more effective public diplomacy towards the Central Asian societies, then the EU would really need to embrace a decentered and what we argue a post-neoliberal approach to its engagement with these societies. And this implies that the EU would have to accept the Central Asian societies for what they are. Among other things, the EU should advocate homegrown forms of self-organization and self-governance that embody an indigenous understanding of good life and an indigenous understanding of good governance. So it should support the ability, the EU should support the ability of local societal actors to self-organize and to draw on their own local strengths and their own local knowledge of available resources and of available of the existing norms, whether it's good governance or good life. So much more than in Western societies, societies in Central Asia, they're collective in nature rather than individualistic. And so this also applies that solidarity among members of the community is much more embedded in local practices and local customs than in Western societies. And we've seen this very strongly with the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has really revealed the crucial role that civil society and community-based initiatives in Central Asian countries play in offering life-saving assistance where the governments have fallen short. In Central Asia, we all know that state capacity is not always strong enough to cope with a crisis of such magnitudes, and vital public services like healthcare and social protection tend to be deficient. And so in such context, societal resilience is crucial in order to stand up to a major crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic. And so therefore, I think that the EU could really increase its legitimacy as an international actor in Central Asia if it starts to accept the Central Asian societies for what they are and really advocate more homegrown self-organization and self-governance, starting from a deep understanding of the local meaning of good life and local knowledge about available resources. Now, I'm not claiming that this approach would suddenly entail a much more effective public diplomacy. Sorry, and I'm not claiming that the EU should abandon all its existing activities in Central Asia. No, the point is rather that the EU's current approach will really need a serious overhaul if it wants its image and its legitimacy in Central Asia to improve. And if not, I'm afraid the EU risks losing out even more in Central Asia in the coming years, as it is unfortunately already losing the struggle for the hearts and minds of the Central Asian people. On this rather negative note, I will end my talk. I thank you very much for your attention, and of course, I will be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Very fascinating. Thank you very much to the OSCE Academy for hosting us today and for all the technical and logistical support they have provided. Thank you, Chiara, for being my very loyal partner in crime.
Thank you, Jan.
And huge thanks to all the speakers. I'm really proud of you guys. Like, I was so happy that you all agreed to give a talk because I really wanted to make sure that we have the best of the best to speak about these topics